Interestingly, I have studied successful companies on what their like long-term retention rate is, and it's not at 40%. It's some companies that are really successful, it's only 5%. And so if we go back to that quote, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. If you can deeply understand the problem, you're way more likely to run tests that have massive impact.
And then you likely find a solution.
Exactly. And it starts all the way down to finding product market fit in the first place before you even embark on starting a business.
Welcome everyone to Cakap Startup special episode. Hi, I'm Lucius Janison Simko Putra, growth marketer. Today we'll have a special episode joined by Sean Ellis. He is the father of growth hacking, writer of the book Hacking Growth, and also he led 5 different startups and more to multiple IPOs, etc. Some that you may have used in your daily lives, such as Dropbox, Eventbrite, LogMeIn, and many others. He also coined the term growth hacking, which we will discuss a lot today, ICE scoring, and also the product market fit survey. Most recently, he worked for a Portuguese company called Bounce, which he helped grow from, and we can cover that later. And without further ado, welcome, Sean.
Thank you very much. It's awesome to be here with you, Lucius, and excited to dig into the topic that is my passion. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So yeah, welcome to Indonesia, Sean. I heard we spoke offline before. Yeah. It's your first time in Indonesia, and it's your first time in Jakarta.
Right.
How do you like Jakarta so far?
It's surprising to me. I thought it was going to be very different than it is. I thought it would be kind of less developed and kind of just crazier with traffic and everything else. But I have to admit that it's probably my favorite or one of my top 2 cities of the entire tour so far. The people are fantastic, but it's also just the contrast of some traditional, on my way here, I walked through like narrow winding streets of a neighborhood, and it was really cool. And then you come out to these really modern buildings and this super modern office. And I don't like when a city is too modern, and I don't like when a city is too traditional. So the blend, I think, is really cool. But most importantly, the people are awesome.
Well, thank you, and thanks for visiting Indonesia. Have you tried any local food by any chance?
I have, but I don't know the names of any of them. But I can tell you that just about everything I've tried has been delicious. So whatever the Indonesian cuisine is, it's aligns with exactly what I like. So it's really good.
Awesome, awesome. And one of my first curious questions is, because I attended your growth summit.
Yeah.
And I always wondered, how do you feel when people actually call you the father of growth hacking?
I don't mind the father. I'm not a big fan of the grandfather of growth hacking, which I've had a couple of times. But yeah, the father of growth hacking, I think it's, again, that suggests that I invented something, and I really didn't invent something. What I did was I said, there's a way that companies are approaching growth that's really different than the traditional way, and it needs a different name. And so I just put a name on what I saw. So I didn't invent it. I just put a name on it. And so that's part of the reason why I think it took off, was that lots of other people recognized it needed a name as well.
Got it. And yeah, I guess we could quickly transition to what is growth hacking? What's the difference between growth hacking? Maybe you can elaborate a little more for our listeners out there. Some of them are newbies, some of them are more experienced. So maybe a simplified version of what's marketing previously, what's growth hacking, what's growth marketing. Is there a difference between all that?
Sure. What I'll start with is just the most basic definition that I like to use is that it's about using data and experimentation to improve not only how you acquire customers, but how you convert customers, how you continue to retain and engage your customers, how you monetize your customers. So you're using experimentation and data, and then to run good experiments, you have to have a deep understanding of your customers. What are the alternative products they can choose? Why is it that they come back and keep using your product? And so there's a lot of, it's very hard to improve what you don't understand. So there's a lot of just learning that's happening. And again, it's all just based on the scientific method that's been around since ancient Greek times, or in parts of it. But it's just a super powerful way of growing businesses. And kind of zoom out a little bit, like, why does it matter? We in the last 2 decades have seen some of the fastest growing companies in history, and they are using a different approach to drive that growth. And that's, again, why I put a name on it. And we documented it really well in Hacking Growth. More than, almost 1 million people have read the book. So there's a lot of awareness that's out there. There are companies all around the world that are using this approach, and they're really outperforming their competitors. But the majority of companies still use the old, traditional, outdated methods of trying to drive growth in their business. And so, it's really been my mission to try to first bring awareness that there's a much better way to drive growth, and then really help companies through that transformation to doing it. And we can get into the details of why it's so hard and why they don't do it if you want to, or you can take the conversation in any direction you want to.
Sure, Sean. Thank you so much for that. So, Sean, you mentioned a lot of a lot of current companies are using the old method.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a little bit more? Like, what exactly is that old method, and what exactly is, I believe the keyword is experimentation process. Yeah. And if you could elaborate a little bit more there.
Sure.
And also, why do you think companies today still cling on these old methods instead of trying these new things?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's great is that we've done a good job with our book, and kind of there's enough people now who are familiar with the term growth hacking and kind of understanding the basics of it. And so the awareness is out there, and I think even the desire to try to adopt these new processes that's out there. But the reason that companies don't effectively adopt them is that it's actually really hard. So it requires changes across the entire company, and most companies, it changes across a company down to the point where ultimately it's about culture change in the company, and culture change is really hard. And so that's the thing that holds them back. So they try. So you probably see a lot of companies now that have growth teams, for example, and roles with growth in there. But I would say that the majority of those companies are actually, they just have a name on it, and they're still doing it the old way. And the old way is basically, I have a marketing team, a product team. So there's some engineers. So if we're talking tech companies, digital companies, I have some engineers and some designers, and they're primarily working with the product team to create a product. Marketing is primarily focused on bringing awareness out there and getting some people to try the product, maybe try the product. More likely, it's just kind of like get them to the website and maybe drive conversions. And they live in their own worlds. And if it's B2B, I think the best example of this is, you look at what is the culture of a sales team in a company, and what is the culture of an engineering team. It could be, as different as France and Japan in terms of cultures. Like it doesn't even feel like it's the same company. And so it becomes really hard for these different silo teams to work well together. And so that's why they stick to the old ways, is that it's just, for decades and decades and decades, that's how companies have done it, by centuries. And so the way that the companies that are really successful are doing it now is that they're centering around a more common goal. They're saying, okay, why do customers need this product? How do customers get value from this product? And how do we work as a team cross-functionally to drive improvement across the entire kind of value delivery engine? And that's the part that's really hard, because it requires them to step out of their comfort zone of how they've always done it.
Gotcha, Sean. So I had 2 curious questions.
Sure.
I'll dive into one real quick now. It's more on the organization side. Mm-hmm. So you think for a company to actually achieve growth hacking at an optimal scale or optimal level, it requires push from someone like a figure on the top, or what would you say would be the best method?
So it helps to have, for sure you want that support from the top. I think and this is really, that's been my, while I'm talking about experimenting inside a company, I'm experimenting with how to actually drive this transformation. It's hard. It's not like I can magically go into any company and automatically have them transform. And so the best thing that I've found is actually getting people to step out of their day-to-day execution, and each of these kind of key roles that aren't used to working together, step out of their day-to-day execution and get them thinking about how does this business really grow and how can we work together to improve that growth. And when they spend a full day together, really getting on the same page around how it grows, the role of experimentation in driving improvement, who does what with experimentation, how much experimentation we should do, making just some of those key decisions, that's the best way to kick it off. So if you just have, say, the CEO who says, work together, guys, and start to do this, that's not enough. That doesn't make it happen. So far, the best thing that I found is to actually get people out of their day-to-day execution, coming together. And so anytime I'm starting with a new company, so I'll kind of back up a little bit. The way that I'm trying to drive this transformation is I alternate between joining a company full-time for 6 months and driving that transformation from the inside. So going really deep to try to do it, and then stepping back and going really wide and trying to help drive the transformation across hundreds of companies. And that's really what this world tour is about that I'm on right now. And so, but when I go to work deep with a company, I know I will fail if I don't, within the first 2 weeks, get everyone together for a full day to talk about how growth works and how we're going to need to work together to drive growth. So that's I think the key part. It's not just a CEO saying to do it, but you have to start the habit of working together in a different way.
Got you. Yeah, I think that's really valuable because I myself have worked in multiple different companies and also in growth roles. And I noticed, I think the biggest challenge of companies is to get everyone to collaborate together and stay on the same page.
Yeah.
Especially with everyone's hectic meetings, etc. But yeah, let's transition real quick to something a bit more that you cover in your book.
Sure.
Which is the pirate metric, the AARR funnel. So for those of you who aren't aware of this, maybe we can listen directly from you, and you could quickly elaborate maybe
what it is and maybe what's important. Yeah,
exactly.
So it's actually an acronym that Dave McClure, an investor for a lot of years, came up with, and the idea was that you need to move beyond just acquisition. So historically, most people, when they think about growth, they're thinking about how do I build awareness. In fact, when I moved to Silicon Valley, the majority of the CEOs who reached out to me and said, "We want you to work with us. We need someone to help us build awareness." And that's important. That's the first step. But from awareness, you actually need to get them to come in and try your product. And so that's the next step. So you're essentially going to, awareness and acquisition, I kind of use as the same thing, but you're essentially you need to activate them. You need to get them to an experience with the product where they want to keep coming back and using the product. And then from there, you need to be able to drive retention. And so the activation step actually is probably the most important step in driving retention. If you don't have a great first experience with a product, you're not going to come back and have a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. But that ultimately, there's a lot of things you can do to drive retention as well. And then interestingly, at Dropbox, one of the big ways that we grew Dropbox was focusing on another lever, which is the referral lever. So we've got now ARR, and so referral is the third R, and then revenue, of course, is another really important part of that. And so ultimately, when you think about R from a growth hacking perspective, you're essentially saying, how do I drive this experimentation process across each of these levers?
Gotcha. So me even speaking to you right now, and I'm sure some of the listeners out there would be curious as to how could a marketing team drive all these metrics,
right? Which
I think maybe you can elaborate a bit more on how, again, that cross-functionality team and that culture that you need to build to effectively run growth. Because, of course, product team needs to be involved. Engineering teams need to be involved. How are they going to fit a lot of these ideas driven by maybe marketing, sales, etc., to be put in the product funnel perhaps?
Yeah, so you're hitting on exactly where the challenge is. So basically, when you're only thinking about growth as acquisition, that's fine. Then the marketing team can do that. They can run a set of experiments. They can keep trying to find new channels for acquiring customers. But activation, retention, referral, those all start to sit in the product organization. And most product organizations are focused on, really a long-term product roadmap. How do we keep making this product better? And, if we just get the magic right, we might not even need marketing anymore. This whole product will take off. And so, but the truth is that most people in most businesses, where you're losing the majority of people is on helping them get started with the product. And so product teams tend not to focus very much there. And so activation is a huge opportunity. But if it's not a priority for the product team, it's not going to be addressed. And maybe it's a priority for the marketing team, but they don't have the authority or the skills to really shape what that first experience is inside the product. And so I'll give you an example from my own past where the light bulb for me went off when I was working at a company called Log Me In. And my title was Vice President of Marketing. And so all of my effort was around how do I acquire customers and do it with a positive return on investment. So if I spend $1, I want to get back at least $1 and hopefully more. And if I can do that, I can keep spending money. And I really got stuck in being able to scale within my area. And I've always been big into testing. So I was testing, different advertisements, different keywords and media and externally and even landing pages. So how do I drive the sign up conversion when they come on the site, all of the tests I can do there. And that all of those things really we were not able to scale the business. And it wasn't until I really dug into the data that I realized that the majority of people who were signing up weren't actually using the product. And if they couldn't use the product, they definitely weren't going to pay for the product. And if they didn't pay for the product, I wasn't going to get my return on investment. And so my ability to be effective as a marketer was at the mercy of the product team prioritizing how do we make it easy to use this product and to get started with it. And this product compared to most was probably harder. It's a Log Me In, if you're not familiar with it, is a remote control product where you put software on your computer. You can then remotely control it from any other computer. So to actually use it, ultimately you need to install it and go to a different computer. And then from that computer, figure out how to access your own computer. And then you get the aha moment that we associate with activation. And so if I went to the product team, they probably wouldn't have recognized the importance of, they would have blamed me. They would have said, the reason that 95% of the people aren't using the product is because you're bringing the wrong people in. Yeah. So they would say it's a marketing problem. And that's where, like, zooming out of your area, is it a marketing problem or is it a product problem? It doesn't really matter. All we know is that it's a problem that's preventing us from providing value to our target customers. And so the problem is people aren't using the product. And so the solution is coming together. And so that was really what we did. We had our CEO step in and say, this needs to be not just an important priority. He actually said it is the only priority that matters right now. So product team, stop developing core product. Marketing team, stop trying to find new channels. Everyone's going to focus on improving the sign up to usage rate. And once he brought us together, so that's where leadership can come in. Once he brought us together to focus on that key objective, within 3 months, we improved our sign up to usage rate by 1,000%.
Wow.
And so we now had half of all people who signed up for the product trying it. And now when I went back into my area of marketing, I could scale very easily. I was able to, no new creativity in marketing, just go back and do the exact same testing that I did before. And now most of it worked, where before most of it didn't. And I could actually spend $1 million a month on marketing with a 3-month payback on those dollars invested. And so that shows the power of when you get marketers, product people, and that also, of course, required engineers, designers, data people, all coming together and focusing on how do we actually get customers to experience value more effectively and more often.
Gotcha. So yeah, Sean, I'm really curious on how, like, did you actually stop all your paid marketing, and how long did that took? Was product team unhappy about it? And you could elaborate a bit.
Sure. Yeah. So again, the product team was not happy when they're told they need to put a freeze on their roadmap. And so it turned out that they actually were focused on this issue for 3 months. So for 3 months, they could not respond to the customer feedback saying, oh, if I just had this feature, or this feature is confusing, all these kind of deeper features. But again, 95% of the people who signed up and showed interest never experienced any feature. So it was the right thing for the CEO to say, we need to get a lot more people to come in and experience it before we prioritize making changes inside the product. So for those 3 months, we focused on it. And again, it was clearly the right choice if we got 1,000% improvement in the sign up to usage rate. And again, during that time, I did not try to build any new channels on the marketing side. We brought our marketing creativity to really try to kind of, obviously come up with some ideas, but also with marketing copy, you can build desire. If you build enough desire, people will go through a lot of pain to try to use the product. So we could really try to get that messaging right and understand where their fears and concerns were, reduce the fears through messaging, and also come up with ideas of how do we make it easier to use and ultimately drive more success.
Gotcha. So from my understanding from what you said is you paused all marketing, all product work, and then you just took all the focus of marketing and product team to specifically
and engineers, designers, everyone together for 3 whole months to make the product
specifically to tackle activation only.
Exactly.
And so I'm a bit curious sorry if I'm deep diving into this entire topic, but so everyone just spent their time and energy on specifically activation, and you just looked at existing customers and just surveyed them.
Well, we had the channels that I had already found. So he didn't say turn off marketing. He just said don't try to find new marketing channels. And I don't think he was deliberate in that to try to help with our testing. But it turned out we weren't really doing A/B testing, and so it was really important not to change the source of the users who are coming in. If you suddenly turn on a new channel, that's going to affect conversion rates. And so for us, it was just really important that one of the benefits of not changing a lot on the marketing side was we had the same mix of people coming in from the same channels. And so most of what we were focused on the marketing side was talking to customers, particularly surveying all those 95% of customers who are signing up and not using. We could go back to them and ask them what happened and whether we had to give them an incentive, but to really, and then even just doing usability testing, bringing in strangers and asking them to go through our sign up process and try to use the product. A lot of times usability testing, I don't think you can get great insights on your core product, but when you give them the task of sign up and use this product, you can get some really good insights of where they're getting stuck. So,
is there friction along the way?
Exactly. And
anything unclear?
Yeah, is something broken? You never know. Like maybe it doesn't work on Chrome, or some kind of situation where we're losing a lot of people simply for a technical reason. So it's very hard to improve something that you don't understand. So we spent a lot of time on that. We studied the installation process on other companies. And so like anything that would give us insights of better tests to run. And then everyone came up with ideas based on the insights we gathered. And then we essentially needed to prioritize which ones we tested. And there wasn't one big thing that moved us from the 5% to the 50%.
It's a bunch of testings.
It was a whole bunch of incremental little improvements everywhere that ultimately got us that point. One other interesting note on this is that I said afterwards we were able to spend $1 million a month. We got that money back in 3 months, so a very fast payback window. And that only accounted for 20% of our new users. 80% of our new users came through word of mouth. So the referral loop. And no incentivized word of mouth, just why do people talk about a product? Because they have a great experience with the product. And so before we had majority of people not having experience. Now we had 10 times as many people having an experience per dollar that we spent. And that's 10 times as many people who have a great experience who are now talking about the product. So
just by fixing one part of the funnel,
Yeah.
which is activation, it
Exactly.
also trickled down to revenue.
So, and you
referrals.
asked me about the pirate metrics. Like, there's a whole set of experiments that we could do across every one of those other pirate metrics. So this was just when we focused on acquisition and activation. And so, yeah, it just shows the power of taking this test learn process that's become so common on the marketing side and starting to apply it deeper inside the product.
Got it. So let's take a step back.
Sure.
We covered a lot of time on this, and we're diving into the PMF survey, which is also referred to as the Sean Ellis survey in some regions of the world.
Right.
Maybe you could share some of your insights on what's a product market fit, or in short, we'll call it PMF for those listeners out there. And one curious question is, how do you know if your service or your product or your offering has reached product market fit? What's a quick way you could test? And basically, a lot of companies operate on the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule. They focus a lot of their time on their best 20%. Should that be the main approach, or does user acquisition still come into play?
All right, so there's a lot of questions there. So I'm gonna start with just the concept of product market fit, and even how I first realized that product market fit's important. So my first two companies, I stayed with each company about 5 years, and both of them from customer zero to IPO filing. So LogMeIn was the second of those companies, and so when I was leaving LogMeIn, I'm a realist, and I said, okay, my next company statistically is going to fail. No one does 3 in a row, so I have to figure out why it's going to fail. And so when I really thought about it, I was like, again, I'm looking through the marketing lens at this point, but I'm thinking I could be really good at getting people to come in and sign up for a product and even use that product. But if they don't like the product after they use it, I can't fix that with marketing. I will fail every time. And so I didn't call it product market fit at the time, but I realized the concept of product market fit was that all this customer acquisition doesn't matter if people don't like the experience once they come in and use the product. And so that was the benefit we had with LogMeIn that we just talked about, was once we got them to use the product, they loved it. But if we went through all of that and they used the product and they still didn't like it, it wouldn't have mattered. We wouldn't have gotten all that word of mouth. We wouldn't have been able to monetize them. They wouldn't have keep coming back and using the product. And so that's really what product market fit is. It's essentially that when someone tries the product, they like it enough to keep using it. And so one way to measure product market fit then is how many people who try the product keep using it. And so the kind of
retention rate.
Yeah, the kind of complicated jargon we talk on that is cohort retention rate. So, 100 people try the product. Of course, let's say if it's a daily use product, after a week, a lot of those people aren't going to use it. It's just normal. Every product, no product retains 100% of its users. And so each day, maybe you go 90%, 80%, 50%, 20%. If ultimately all 100 people stop using the product, you do not have product market fit. No one who tried it wants to keep using it. And so in order to be able to grow the business, you need to be able to retain some percentage of the users. And so, most products are not daily use products. Like if you're thinking about, say, Airbnb, maybe you're only using that product like 2 times a year. So it would take you a lot of years to know if you have product market fit or not. And so the real challenge, as I said, I knew I would fail if a company didn't have product market fit. And so there's a big study that's been done that essentially discovered that trying to grow a product without product market fit is the number one cause of startup failure. That essentially it's expensive to try. We're paying the money to acquire the customers. We need to have a support team to support them. We really need to scale the operations of the business when we start trying to acquire customers. And if we can't keep those customers, we're essentially accelerating our path to going out of business. And so if you want to be able to know for sure if you have product market fit, and you don't want to have to wait months, because the other side is if you do have product market fit and you're too conservative in trying to grow it, you're going to miss your window of opportunity. And it may be that if there's an opportunity for a product to serve a need better than the existing products, you're just the first to get there if you have product market fit. But it's only a matter of time before someone else puts a competing product out there. So you have this window to operate in to really try to scale. And so the retention cohort method is the most effective, but it takes a long time to know if you have it or not. So I came up with a shortcut when I was right before Dropbox, which was basically I said, okay, I'm just going to ask the users how they would feel if they couldn't use the product anymore. And so a simple survey question. In the past, people would kind of try to uncover this as a satisfaction question. How satisfied are you? But it's really hard to get signal with that. One person's very satisfied, someone else is somewhat satisfied. But by flipping it and saying, how would you feel if you could no longer use this product? You get a more honest answer. I would either be very disappointed, or I would be somewhat disappointed, I wouldn't even care, or I've stopped using your product already. And so I started to find that companies who I asked that question to on their products, when I got about 40% of the users saying they would be very disappointed without the product, I could grow those businesses. And so, 40% or more. So when I was at Eventbrite, we actually had like 80% of users said they'd be very disappointed without the product. Wow. When I was at Dropbox, we had 50% of users who said they'd be very disappointed. And then the next company I went to, I ran the survey and it came back as only 7% of users would be very disappointed. And so that was not a product that was growable. And so then the question is like, do I leave? Do I stay? And ultimately, the only thing I knew for sure is I don't try to grow it. We have to fix this. And so whether I could help with fixing it or not, if you don't have product market fit, the only thing that matters is fixing to get to product market fit. Yeah. And so fortunately with that company, we got it there in about 2 weeks.
Oh, awesome.
Which
could you share a bit?
Yeah, you wouldn't expect that, I would have even thought that it's going to take us months and months or maybe even years or maybe never. But so what I did was I studied the 7% of users who said they would be very disappointed without the product. And I found that they were focused on one main use case. There was kind of 4 different ways to use the product. They had figured out one way that perceived as being very valuable, which this was a security product, and the company is called Lookout. And so with Lookout, all I did was I said, okay, so they're focused on the antivirus instead of the backup. And this was before all these were built into phones. So they're focused on the antivirus instead of the firewall or the backup or the find your lost phone mode. And so I just changed the messaging on the page, on the landing page to focus on
specifically that
antivirus. So that's half of the solution. And then the other half of the solution was activation. Instead of having them, they come in on a message of antivirus. If we didn't change the product experience, they still would have hit a screen then that says
all these
set up backup, set up find your lost phone. But instead, we took them to a screen that said, set up your antivirus. And then afterwards, we introduced those other use cases. And so that new group of people, when they went through the new flow and we surveyed them, they were at 40%. 6 months later, it was at 60% of people said they'd be very disappointed. And then that company raised around about 5 years later that valued them over $1 billion. So
that's amazing.
Once we got it to the 40%, it comes down to an execution where can we cost effectively acquire enough users who come in and sign up for the antivirus. And so, we were able to do that at that point.
So let me just pause right there real quick, just so the listeners can take that all in. And just want to re-emphasize on how you could test quickly. Basically, you need a 40% retention rate. And what that means is you just need to do a quick survey to your existing customers and ask them if your product doesn't exist anymore, would they be disappointed or not?
Yeah. So one nuance that I want to cut, it's you need the 40% was just kind of a shortcut benchmark, and that's on the survey. Interestingly, I have studied successful companies on what their long-term retention rate is, and it's not at 40%. It's some companies that are really successful, it's only 5%. Some companies are 50% or more. And so from an actual retention rate perspective, what's more important is that you retain long-term some percent of your users. And so Calm, the meditation app, for example, worth billions of dollars as a business, but they only retain about 5% of their customers. 5% of the people who sign up and pay for it. So long-term retain. So, but that's fine. As long as, like I, for example, have been a paying Calm user for probably 7 years already. So like there's enough of people like me out there that are long-term customers that the model works.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing everything, Sean. In the next section, we actually want to spend a bit of time, maybe 10, 15 minutes on a lot of the technical questions and tips from your experience, from your case studies from all the companies you worked for and consulted for. Because I'm sure all of these concepts are quite simple to grasp, especially if you read this book. But when you do it in practice, a lot of challenges.
Way harder, for sure.
Way harder. So we'll go one by one. And the first question is on product market fit. How do you make sure you have achieved product market fit, especially if the business actually, again, operates on Pareto, which is the 80-20 rule? Like, do you focus your time on 20% of the people that drive the most revenue? Or is it 20% of the people who use the application the most? Like, what would be your take
again,
on that?
we kind of go back to that lookout study. What I'm doing is I'm figuring out what is I want to get the signal of the must-have people. So I can either do that by focusing on how they use the product or what their profile is, or kind of a combination of both. So so that's where it becomes kind of fun with the data, is you can start to segment the data and say, if I only look at what the women answer to that question or what the men answer to that question, I'm going to get probably a very different answer. And so I was talking with a local entrepreneur yesterday who primarily sells products to pregnant moms, for example. Like, if I ran that question, the men are probably going to say, I wouldn't really care if this product no longer existed. And so that's a really natural one to know that is the target market is going to be women at least. But then as I dig more in, maybe then I learn it's actually pregnant women. And then I can sub-segment it even more, that it's pregnant women with this belief system or whatever it might be. And so one of what you want to do is be able to find, what is my target market that really needs this product?
So first find out who really needs and cares about your product, and then figure that out.
Secondly, why do they need it? And how are they using it that makes it a must-have? And so
then scale from there.
Yeah. And then so ultimately, it's not really so much an 80-20 anymore. It's that all of my efforts are getting those type of people to understand this is what the product can do, and then quickly make sure that it delivers on that promise.
Gotcha. And jumping a bit on that, a bit more technical, because I remember I faced this issue personally when I worked in Indonesia, is how do you actually effectively run surveys or these case studies or interviewing these people? Because a lot of Indonesians, and probably all the listeners out there experience this, is it's really hard to get an honest feedback with integrity unless we incentivize them. So there's a two-part issue where one is we can't get big enough sample size to make a conclusion. The second part is when we do get that big sample size, it's usually driven by incentives. We give them vouchers, discounts, etc. But when they actually fill in these surveys, they just go 5, 5, 5, 5, 5.
Just kind of randomly,
and then submit.
Yeah. So one thing is that ideally, I actually know who the people are who are answering the survey. So it's not a random survey. So if they said, I would be very disappointed without this, and then I see that they never use the product, like that starts to tell me that there's no integrity to that surveying process. And so I think that's part of it. But interestingly, I find that there's a very tight correlation to response rate to the survey and the percentage of people who would be very disappointed without the product. If most people kind of don't care that much about the product, it's really hard to get a high response rate. So I might have maybe like a 1 or a 2% response
So
rate
your
to the
suggestion
survey.
would be, even during these surveys, you segment it into different sections?
No, you don't want to bias the sample. Like if you said I only want to survey the people who've used it 100 times, you're going to have a high. But it's just you want to have a random sample of people who've used it at least a couple of times, and that they've really used it. They didn't just sign up, but they came in and used it, because their feedback, if they just signed up, who cares? So I want to get a random sample of people who've come in and experienced that. And I've had it as high as 10 or 20% in some companies on the response rate. But ultimately, for a really early stage company, it may be really hard to get even 10 responses. And so it doesn't really matter what your response rate is. What you're trying to find initially is at least one person who tells you that they'd be very disappointed without the product. So I've never had to use incentives for this. So if you have to use incentives, I think I would be really, so one of the interesting kind of language things, so language really matters around a lot of these things, is you stated as a fact that people in Indonesia have a lower response rate to surveys. So we do this. Do you have statistical evidence that that's a fact, or is that just based on your anecdotal? I know you worked in the U.S. and then you came here, and so to me, a really interesting shortcut on a lot of this is just to say, I have a strong hypothesis based on my own experience that people in Indonesia respond to surveys at a lower rate. And so that's just when you start to frame everything as hypotheses, you actually get into a mode where you start to say, where can I find the data to validate that? Or is there some tests that I can run to validate that? So that's just an aside there. But again, like coming back to it, that initially what you're trying to find is that signal. So I think of product market fit as basically you have to crowdsource it. So you initially have an idea for a business, you start the business, and you may find that nobody cares what you built. You may find that everybody cares what you built. So like in the case of LogMeIn and Dropbox, the initial vision turned out to be really right. But a lot of products, YouTube started as a dating video site. Instagram started as a location check-in site. And so like a lot of products, ultimately the founding teams were smart enough to say, or observant enough to say, wow, there's a group of people that are using this in a different way and they love it. And how do we ride that signal to ultimately building a real business here? So the most elusive thing, the hardest thing about being a founder is creating something that people actually want in the first place. And so you have to go into it with that mindset that my initial vision is probably a little bit wrong. And the only way to know it's right is to find somebody who tells you that they love what you've created and that they can't live without it. And so so the love piece is a little scary, because that's where I think cultural bias can come in, that some cultures might be way more optimistic, some cultures may be more pessimistic. But I do think when you ask, would it matter if it disappeared, you do get an answer that says, okay,
and it's a very honest answer.
Yeah,
usually.
and then it's about going deep and really understanding, why does it matter? What did they used to use before? Why is this better? What's your profile? How do we get more people like you using the product this way?
Gotcha. And we could quickly transition to North Star metric, which is basically one metric the entire company should be striving towards for. The question would be like, how do you actually identify that North Star metric? Because typically companies will, especially younger companies, will just be revenue driven,
right?
Or even maybe user acquisition driven.
Yeah.
Like how would a team or a company benefit from listening to this podcast from you, and what would be your answer?
So let me transition from the topic we were just on to North Star metric. Then I think we should talk about why a North Star metric is important and what it actually is.
Sure.
But so what we just said is that you can't sustainably build a business unless you find the right group of people who get value from the product. That's going to be based on who they are and what their needs are and how they use the product. So once you've identified that, then you start to have signal on what is the actual value of this product that makes it a must-have. Your North Star metric is essentially saying, how much of that value are we delivering over time? And so sustainable growth is about delivering value that brings people back. And if I can quantify that into a metric that lets me know real success then is how many times I'm delivering that value and how often I'm delivering that value. And so that as a metric compared to revenue, you might be really good at getting people to buy something, but if they're not getting value, they're not going to keep buying it and they're going to cancel. So if you're optimizing for revenue, a lot of times it's not going to be sustainable growth. But if you're optimizing for value delivery, then you can drive sustainable growth. And then your revenue is important for that sustainability. You still have the bills to pay, but you want to make sure your revenue grows with your ability to grow value. And so that's what we're trying to do with the North Star metric is quantify how much value are we delivering. So the big benefit of the North Star metric, one, is that it's a good indicator of sustainable growth. And two, it becomes a single metric that is not a departmental metric, not one of the silo metrics. Now you have something that the whole company plays some kind of role in growing that metric. Marketing may be adding the new people who contribute that metric. And then core product is how do I get those new people to experience it in a way that they come back? And then how do I build the mechanisms in the product that remind them to come back? And maybe even sales or someone who's managing revenue might be, how do I maximize the revenue from the way those people are using it?
Like an after sales or something.
So that's one of the big values of the North Star metric is it becomes an aligning metric that kind of gets people out of their own departmental goals and says, this is the big picture of what really meant. This is it's kind of quantifying progress against our mission of the business, our goal of the business. We exist to deliver some kind of value, and this is how we measure that.
Understood. And
I recommend that we give a couple of examples because it can still be kind of confusing.
Sure. We can transition to that.
Cool. So I think one of the best examples is if we look at like Grab, for example. So for Grab, you have two sides to the marketplace. You've got let's just say just on the ride side of Grab, you've got the people who are driving the cars, and then you've got the passengers who are riding in the cars. And so I, for example, took a Grab on the way here. My value was that I got where I needed to go. And so what Grab then is measuring is how many rides are delivered each week. And so if we delivered 1,000 rides this week and 2,000 rides the next week, we delivered twice as much value as we previously did. And so the reason that's also valuable for the drivers is that they make money from each ride. You could make it more complicated and you could say, longer rides are better, but if the more complicated you make it, the less of a unifying metric it becomes because it's just confusing and people don't understand it. So keeping it simple as just weekly rides is a really good one. I think one of the examples that's kind of a little harder to maybe understand would be Amazon, or what's the local equivalent to Amazon here?
Shopee or Tokopedia.
Okay, so if you take Shopee, you could kind of say, normally, companies would optimize on how much revenue are we generating from product sales. But if you really think, what is the job of like a big, broad e-commerce site? It's to help you find and buy the things that you need when you need them. And so from a customer's perspective, buying a toothbrush is probably as valuable as buying a refrigerator. And it's a unit of value. I needed a toothbrush. I bought a toothbrush. I got it. And so, but from the company perspective, one may seem way more valuable, but the best North Star metric for companies like that is just how many purchases happen in a given period of time, like monthly purchases. There's a unit of value that happens. And so obviously you want to get the revenue side up and you don't want to optimize necessarily on low margin, cheapest purchases, but you just have to look at it through the lens of the customer of what is the real job of the product we're creating and how many times are we achieving that job for the customer.
Gotcha. And I'll just hop on to that whole North Star metric because this topic is really interesting.
Sure.
I'm really curious on how you yourself and in your experience, how long did it take for a company to figure out like what their North Star metric is? And when you joined these companies, was it clear, or did you have some sort of input on like, hey guys, this is actually the value we deliver for our customers. This is where we should be going. And of course, was there mistakes along the way? Because I know a lot of companies have a certain metric and they probably are aware of what a North Star metric is, but sometimes it might be wrong.
Yeah, so I didn't really even, I never heard the name North Star metric until kind of halfway through my career. So some of the earlier companies, we used the concept, but without thinking of the name. And so I think Dropbox is a great example. We were focused on registrations initially. And that's why I was being praised by our board of directors. They were like, I can't believe you're driving thousands of people every day to sign up for this product. You are amazing. And I'm patting myself on the back, feeling great. But it wasn't until I dug into the numbers that I saw 95% of those people are never using the product. So that would be a case of kind of using the wrong metric. And it's really challenging because we had a free version of the product and a paid version. So just signing up for the free version, we could make that claim we have 1 million users. But we wouldn't have had 1 million users. We have 1 million people who signed up for something they've never used. And you could say, well, it's for emergencies. If they need it, they'll use it sometime in the future. But if they never install the software, even in the emergency, they wouldn't be able to use it. And so that's ultimately, trying to figure out what is that value that's there. So that would be an example of, I didn't call it a North Star metric, but we weren't focused on value. I was focused on what I could directly drive as a marketer. And so, but to go back to your question of how long does it take to come up with the North Star metric, what I typically see is teams debate it for 6 months and still don't have a North Star metric. And then when I, like in my workshops, is a big part of how I drive the transition in companies, I give them 30 minutes. So you got 30 minutes to come up with a North Star metric. I give them all the checklist of what a good North Star metric looks like. They can ask me questions. If I'm working with one company, I'll be part of that process. If I'm working with multiple companies at the same time, then I'm standing back and letting them have that conversation. But I think in 30 minutes, they can come up with a North Star metric that is probably as good as the North Star metric they would come up with if they debated for 6 months. And so it's better to kind of time box it and have the benefits to execute on and maybe be a little bit off. So that the other thing is to think about is that for most companies, there's not the perfect North Star metric and everything else is wrong. There's probably a few pretty good North Star metrics and maybe one that's better than everything else. But if you used any of them, that would probably be okay and it would serve its purpose well. So always in my workshops, I start with the whole question of, do we have product market fit? If so, what is it? What's the value? And then now, how do we build a North Star metric off of that value?
Gotcha. All right. Thank you so much, Sean. And we'll just quickly dive into some rapid fire questions in the essence of time. Yeah. And I'll just read from the prompter.
Sounds good.
So first one is, what's your take of using memes? And typically it has a really high engagement rate, but it usually hurts the brand.
Yeah.
But for startups maybe, or even any companies, what's your take on memes?
So my general take on kind of anything, I used to annoy people a lot in my first company before I ever thought of growth hacking or anything else, was my answer was always, just test it. Just test it. Should we use red? Should we use blue? Should we use this banner? Should we use this? Should we use this landing page? Just test it. Just test it. So I would say with memes, it's going to be, for some companies, it might be great. So I would test that as a potential acquisition channel. But ultimately, it's about the North Star metric. If you're not acquiring the right type of people who have the right experience with the product, then you are not creating any value in your business. So ultimately, it comes down to, even if you acquire a whole bunch of people who bounce, but within the dollars, within the kind of unit economics of making it work, you're bringing in enough of the right people who have the right experience that you can long-term retain, then it's great.
Awesome. Second question would be, was there like a philosopher, a marketer, a writer of a book perhaps that maybe inspired you to do all of this?
I wouldn't say a particular that inspired to do all of it, but one that I come back to. I tend to come back to certain books over and over and read them, 5 times, and maybe like every 2 years go back and read it. So one I go back to a lot is Influenced by Cialdini. that there's a lot of psychology here and knowing what prevents people from doing things and what encourages people to do things. So small commitments lead to big commitments is an example of how can I onboard people. If they say they're going to do something, they want to be consistent with what they say they're going to do. Bandwagon effect of like, how do you use lots of other people's decisions to make it easier to make a decision in your favor? And so ultimately, we're trying to drive people to the right experience in the product. And there's a lot of psychology that book gives me of ideas for tests that I want to run.
Got it. Third one is if someone was thinking of starting a growth team or maybe shifting their mark, basically after reading your book or listening to this podcast or any material you post online, they decided we need a growth team. What would be your suggestion? Like, what are key roles in a growth team that any company who's thinking of creating a growth team needs?
Right. So one, I would start with the goal of what you're actually trying to do with a growth team, which is you are trying to run experiments across each of the areas that matter for accelerating growth. And ideally, you're focusing those experiments on the area that matters the most. So like at LogMeIn, when we focused on activation when it was really broken at LogMeIn. And so probably one of the biggest evolutions in my thinking since I coined the term growth hacking in a blog post in 2010 is that at that time I was at Dropbox. There was 8 people at Dropbox. I was kind of brought in as like head of marketing and growth, but everyone else was an engineer. And so it kind of made sense that I'm going to focus on acquiring and converting and retaining and monetizing customers because no one else in the company was doing that. And so in a small company, maybe you're okay to do that. But what I have learned is that if the team or person who's running growth is also responsible for the marketing side, it tends not to work. So if we go back to the pirate metrics framework, most of those metrics sit inside the product organization. So if your marketer, and this is why I don't like the term growth marketing, because as soon as you are the growth marketer, the product team doesn't want you to have any influence over what happens in the product, yet so much of your potential to drive growth and impact sits inside the product. So my evolution is that the growth team should sit on top of the existing kind of traditional organization and essentially help to run experiments wherever they can drive the most impact. And so day one, it might just be one person. And I think that's the best way to start, because if you say we're going to need engineers, designers, and data people, it might take you 6 months to build that team. So you have one person whose goal it is to help accelerate the rate of experimentation and hopefully focus those experiments where they can drive the most impact. And then if each time they want to run an experiment, they're finding that they can't get a designer because the designers are so busy on core product work or core website work, then maybe the first hire I make is a growth designer, or same thing with an engineer, a growth engineer. And so I tend to try to build out the team around the bottlenecks that prevent a high velocity of testing. And so one of the big, like simple takeaways for listeners, I would say is if you only focus on one thing coming out of here, I'd say just focus on increasing the number of experiments you run. If you do that, you are likely to increase your growth. If you can then also run those experiments across all of those R levers, you're going to have a lot more impact. And then if you can use a North Star metric to make sure that the experiments are actually increasing value, you've got almost the whole thing.
Got it.
But still buy my book anyway.
And last rapid fire question is, for example, a great transition from just what you said. If you set up your team, they've run a bunch of experiments, etc. So these are for the more technical, experienced people out there, and usually they're in the data team.
Yeah.
Does these experiments require statistical significance, or is just incremental growth over and over again enough?
Yeah. So statistical significance is really important, and if you have a company with a lot of flow of users, you should use statistical significance to make all of your decisions. And a lot of people even do that wrong. I'm not going to go into the details, but you don't wait until it has statistical significance. You actually decide up front what your sample size will be. And there's 3 outcomes. it either
Works.
it's a winner or it's
Doesn't
a loser or it's inconclusive. And if it's inconclusive, then you have to start the whole experiment over. You can't just extend the sample size. But that's the data purist method. And I didn't even know that myself until probably 2 years ago. And I've had a lot of success before that. So I don't think you need the data purist effort. But what you really need is a desire to find opportunities for improvement where they matter most in your business and a genuine effort to drive that improvement. And so sometimes right in the beginning, it might be as simple as, that log me in case. If we didn't look at any data beyond knowing that only 5% of our users are using the product, we probably could have fixed a lot of that without running a single kind of test or looking at data as we ran the test, simply by running usability tests, come up with some ideas, change some things, run another usability test, change things. And eventually we get to the point where almost everyone who starts the process can effectively get to the point where they can do a remote control session. That would have probably helped us achieve what we needed to achieve. And that's kind of one person at a time going through that funnel. Even the way that we did it, as I mentioned, was not an optimal way. Now in hindsight, I didn't really think you could run A/B tests at that level. I thought you could only do it on surface level pages. So we didn't do any of those activation improvements with A/B tests. We just did them before and after tests. And how many people get to this? What percentage get to this step? Before, look, we increased the percent that get to this step. And so there's always a better way to do everything, but it really starts with just have that genuine desire to improve and find that better way. And as the numbers get bigger, then statistical significance will help you make the right decisions as you're going along. Yeah.
Got you. All right. So on to our last question. So if you could share one thing, a quote or a philosophy that you live by, what would you share to your younger self?
Yeah. So I only stumbled across this quote in the last couple of years, and I absolutely love it. And it's like 100-year-old quote or something. Maybe not quite 100 years, but it's from a guy named Kettering. And he was in General Motors, ran the innovation kind of department. And so his quote is, "A problem well stated is a problem half solved." And so I think so many people, when they're in growth, they get into the mode of just test, measure, where what I have found is that my likelihood of running a test that's extremely successful, it goes way up if I can deeply understand what the actual problem is. And so take the time to try to diagnose what the problem is. And now a lot of times historically when we think about marketing and creativity, we think, what's that clever slogan or that really creative idea of a attention-getting guerrilla marketing tactic, where a lot of this is actually, it's very creativity-driven, but it's creative problem-solving. And so if we go back to that quote, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. If you can deeply understand the problem, you're way more likely to run tests that have massive impact.
And then you likely find a solution.
Exactly. And it starts all the way down to finding product market fit in the first place. Before you even embark on starting a business, so many of us go straight into trying to build the solution instead of deeply understanding the problem that we're trying to solve. And you're more likely to miss product market fit. And I've made that mistake myself. And so if you can not just understand it, but it says well stated, so you can understand it and articulate it, then you're halfway to the solution.
Got it. Thank you so much for your response, Sean.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so just closing in the podcast. So where can the listeners find you?
Right now in Jakarta, but I think probably the channel I'm most active on these days is LinkedIn, and I accept all my LinkedIn invites that people send to me. So yeah, feel free to send me an invite, and then when someone spams me on LinkedIn, then I remove the connection. So that's my test learn process is like I assume everyone is good, and then if they just hound me on spammy stuff, then I just remove the connection. So please, send me a connection, and we can stay connected that way. And I appreciate the opportunity to connect with the Indonesian community here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us today. I hope you enjoy our beautiful country, and if you ever visit again, you can hit us up.
Thank you, Lucius. And it was a great set of questions you had there.
Thank you.